All right. My name is Bridget Cooks, and I am the curator of the exhibition called The Black Index. And I am also associate professor in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Art History at the University of California, Irvine. I want to welcome everyone to this exciting program this evening, Black Manicule Pointing Elsewhere with scholar Courtney R. Baker. So to start, no one is as delighted as I am to be with you here this evening for this event. It's presented on the occasion of the opening of the exhibition, The Black Index, that opened virtually at UC Irvine today. It's a project that I've been working on for a few years as curator, alongside the exhibition manager, Sarah Watson, who is chief curator of the Hunter Art Galleries in New York. I'd like to thank the artists in the exhibition. I'd like to thank artist, professor, and director of the University Art Galleries at UCI, Kevin Appel, the Contemporary Art Center Gallery curator, Allison Unzicker, and preparators Andrew McNeely and Tariq Garrett for their support with the exhibition at UCI. There's also a number of sponsors and other people, organizations at UCI and beyond who have helped. So I want to mention the Ford Foundation. I'd like to mention Doug Haynes and the Confronting Extremism Initiative and the Black Thriving Initiative here at UCI, the Getty Research Institute, the UCHRI program, which is UC-wide, that helped to fund some of these events. And just acknowledge all of the support that you've given for the exhibition, particularly here at UC Irvine. I'd like to just say a few things about the exhibition before I introduce our speaker. The Black Index is an exhibition of work by 6 artists: Alicia Henry, Lava Thomas, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, Dennis Delgado, Titus Kafar, and Whitfield Lovell. Through their work, these artists build on the tradition of Black self-representation as an antidote to colonialist images. The exhibition frames their art as a creative index, an alternative to the barrage of photographs of Black people who have been arrested, incarcerated, and who have died, often by violent means. Through a variety of innovative approaches, each of the artists addresses the paradox of being Black in America, which is to be alive but have little social value. The artists' works focus on the resilience and beauty of Black people, despite the fact that we live in very dire political and social conditions. Please find more information about the exhibition, including its programs and its national tour at theblackindex.art, which is on your screen here. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Courtney R. Baker. Baker is a specialist on the impact of visual culture in Black life. She is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside. And her book, Humane Insight, which I'm going to hold up for you, the subtitle is Looking at Images of African American Suffering and Death. Okay, here it is. It was published in the New Black Study series, edited by the revered Darlene Hine and Dwight McBride by the University of Illinois Press in 2015. Baker has written academic and popular essays on African American film, the history of the image in African American activism, and the ethics of narratives about death. She teaches courses on Black film, African American literature, race and ethnicity in American studies, cultural studies, and critical theories of the human and the visual. We will have time for a discussion with Professor Baker, prompted by audience questions in about 45 minutes. Please type your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This event is also being recorded and will be available shortly on the exhibition website. So for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Courtney R. Baker.
Thank you so much for that extremely warm welcome, Dr. Cooks, Bridget. Um, I am overjoyed to be able to help launch the virtual exhibition, which will eventually be touring in its physical form. I would like to also extend my gratitude to Chris Wong and Allison Unzicker with their conviction and their help with all of these technical arrangements, and to also very sincerely thank everybody who is working behind the scenes and also who has managed to show up. I think it's important to acknowledge that even showing up is a difficult task to undertake these days. So I'm grateful to everyone for that. Getting into my talk, as I said, I'm really honored and excited to be speaking today on a subject that is in many ways close to my heart, not only as a scholar of African American visual culture and visual practices, but also because of the particular way that Dr. Cooks has framed the exhibition, and the title that she chose for it really allowed me to kind of return to my interest in the study of signs, semiotics, which is something I'm going to kind of tease out a little bit in this talk that I prepared, which is very early in its stages of being thought through. Nevertheless, I hope that it's where it points offers some insights and things to be excited about and to look forward to. So when I received this invitation to speak, I immediately said yes, knowing that the works exhibited and their critical framing with the Black Index would grant me an occasion to continue my thinking on Black visual art practices and the relationship to Black and specifically to African American politics of representation. I was captivated in particular by Cook's use of the word index and the exhibition's stated desire, and here I'm quoting from the curatorial statement, to quote, build upon the tradition of Black self-representation as an antidote to colonialist images, using drawing, performance, printmaking, sculpture, and digital technology to transform the recorded image. These artists question our reliance on photography as a privileged source for documentary objectivity and understanding. Their works offer an alternative practice, a Black index, that still serves as a finding aid for information about Black subjects, but also challenges viewers' desires for classification. End quote. These conceptual and material investments strike me as honing in on the political and existential stakes of image making for Black subjects in our increasingly screen and image-based societies. My remarks today are going to revisit some of the core principles of the study of signs known as semiotics in order to further excavate the embedded wisdom that boldly addresses and might freshly illuminate an appreciation of the stakes of Black visual representation. I thought to start literally with the index itself as a reference to the human hand, the forefinger, and the codification of its gesture of pointing out with the forefinger, also referred to as an index finger. The logics that cohere around the index locate their origins and their inescapable reference in the human hand. Even the disembodied concept of the index, loosened from anatomy's hold in uses such as the book index, nonetheless point back to the human body, to the human hand and its particular labors in distinguishing items of importance. As I pursued these connections, I thought of the hieroglyph known as the Manicule, and this is an example of one of my favorite examples of the Manicule. You can see the illustrations on the right of the fingers pointing, and these are, I believe it's 12th century, they're medieval manicules written to point out the areas where the cat has broken into the library and peed on the manuscript. The images of hands with outstretched pointing fingers have been drawn, painted, or otherwise inscribed into the margins of manuscripts in Western cultures since at least the 12th century. The manicule's function as a symbol for readers was significant and enduring enough that it survived the transition to movable type and was translated into an engraved block known as a sort, enabling it to be readily available for modern printmaking. It continues to appear in the notably named digital typography that we engage largely with now as a wingding or a webding in digital font packages. From the index to the manicule to the digital, it seems that hands are always pointing us somewhere. In addition to orthography and typography, there are other discourses in which the index prominently figures. The first, the one that is explicitly mentioned in the description of the exhibition that I read, is the photographic index. This use of the term points back to the originating composition of objects in real space as they appeared before the camera shutter's aperture. In the instant of the shutter's release, in the quick opening and closing of the aperture, the light reflecting off of the objects before the camera make an impression upon a photosensitive plate or film, ultimately producing an image that references not only the objects, but the time and perspective contained within that instant. The photographic index, as photography theorists Roland Barthes and Alan Sekula have told us, points backward to a moment already poised to recede into the irretrievable past, defying the possibility of empirical verification. I'll say more on these phenomenological and existential issues with photographic indexicality in a moment, but here I wish to elaborate just a bit more on the technology of the photographic camera. It is worth emphasizing that the photographic index does not touch its material reference, which is to say that it is not the hand nor the hand's prosthetic, a pen or a brush, that makes the visual impression, that marks the surface of the recording plane with the image of the camera's subject. It is light itself that makes the mark. I also, in this consideration of indexicality, find it useful, if not imperative, to return to the semiotic terminology inherited from 19th century American semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce. His classification system distinguishing icon, symbol, and index is a strong, if incomplete, place from which to launch inquiries into the phenomenological and the existential nature of visual cultures. In her introduction to the special issue of the journal Differences, media scholar Mary Ann Doan engages the stakes and shortcomings of Peirce's system. And I apologize for the length of this quotation. I'm going to read it as it is so nuanced and dense that it bears reading in full. Doan writes, "The index as defined by Charles Sanders Peirce occupies an uncomfortable position in the complex taxonomy of signs he elaborated in the latter half of the 19th century. In contrast to the icon's relatively straightforward resemblance and the symbol's conventionality or arbitrariness, the index sustains a less clear-cut physical or existential relation to its object. In its iconicity, the index as trace has unfortunately suggested for many theorists an alliance with realism as both style and ideology. in its intimacy with the symbolic, the index as a shifter, what Doan here is calling a deixis, forces language to adhere to the spatiotemporal frame of its articulation. As photographic trace or impression, the index seems to harbor a fullness and excessiveness of detail that is always supplemental to meaning or intention. Yet the index as deixis implies an emptiness, a hollowness that can only be filled in specific, contingent, always mutating situations. It is this dialectic of the empty and the full that lends the index an eeriness and uncanniness not associated with the realms of the icon or symbol. At times, the disconcerting closeness of the index to its object raises doubts as to whether it is indeed a sign, suggesting instead that the index is perched precariously on the very edge of semiosis. So I'm inspired by Doan's questioning, interrogating of the ways in which the index functions sometimes like a symbol, sometimes like an icon, as well as Nikki Green's and others' calls to reinterrogate the non-photographic, structuralist, and modernist definitions of the index in specific relation to Black visual forms, such as what Nikki Green conducts in her brilliant chapter, Riffing the Index, which discusses Ramar Bearden's photostat collage work. Green explains that in Bearden's work, quote, the cuts, the paint, and the residual glue become something altogether different when photographed and made into prints. It becomes, in essence, an accumulation of indexes, traces of Bearden's training, knowledge, and experiences. What Green, Doan, and others offer in considering the index in semiological terms is a way to think and to talk about the conditions determining the visual transmission of knowledge about race. I offer all of these as a sort of preamble for my consideration of the logics and illogics of indexicality in operation within Black visual culture, and specifically regarding the imaging and imagining of African-American women. Now, I concur with the sentiment that Dr. Cooks has articulated to frame the Black Index exhibition, namely that photorealist desires and interpretations tend to dominate conversations about what Black life looks like. I might even go further and suggest, as I have elsewhere, that Black life, and in particular Black femme life, always exceeds its indexical reference. In Lava Thomas's work, seen here, I see an effort to provide redress for the decades-old injustice conducted by the photographic camera, by the genre of the mugshot photo portrait, and by those who wielded the law, the image, and the women of the bus boycott themselves as illicit objects. The Black Index features one of Thomas's graphite and pencil drawings based on the 1956 mugshot of Alberta James. What I notice about Thomas's drawing is that in one register, it appears redundant. The drawing faithfully, one might even say obsessively, reproduces the mugshot photo, converting all that was captured in the instant of a shutter click into a contemplative, arduous processing of rendering textures, anatomy, skin tone, and facial expression. This is a process that requires an elongation of the time of looking and the time of drawing. Indeed, it was the drawing rather than the photograph that I first noticed that Mrs. James is only wearing one glove. Where did it go? At what point in the process of arrest was the glove lost? What rushed conditions resulted in her keeping that glove on while her other hand went unsheathed? And what of these hands? They are certainly placed. They are certainly placed. They hold on to and point to something, an arrest number, something that does not serve the interests of the sitter, Alberta James. Translating the photograph into a drawing disrupts, I think, the easy and almost instantaneous understanding of the number placard as being in its proper place, while the woman holding it is not. In the drawing, we can see that Mrs. James holds the placard lightly, carefully, perhaps instructed, not to cover the digits with her own digits. It is difficult to interpret the mass and density of the sign, as it seems almost to float out of her hands. Maybe it is pressed against her chest, the friction of her nubby suit securing the placard in place. But despite the work they have been conscripted to perform by keeping the number card in place, Mrs. James's hands point elsewhere. The index finger of her right ungloved hand points upward toward the top right of the image and toward her face. In her drawing, Thomas has made sure to emphasize Mrs. James's face, making it reflect as much light as the indistinguishable background before which she is seated. Her eyes, too, while they are dark, impenetrable points in the photograph, are rendered in the drawing as brighter, reflecting more light, or perhaps emanating a light that burns from within. Thomas gives a similar treatment to one of Mrs. James's fellow protesters, Rosa Parks. Again, we see illuminated eyes and carefully drafted hands, awkwardly fondling the arrest number. Mrs. Parks' almost tender handling of the sign. Note how her index fingers, also pointing past the number and upward toward her face, barely caress the placard's edges. It is in provocative contrast to how she and others were literally handled by the law. In the photograph of Mrs. Parks's fingerprinting, taken and conducted on the same day as the arrest, and we can note that this is the same outfit, we see an officer handling her hands. Once again, Parks's hands are being conscripted to perform an act that is not in service to the hand's owners. I note too the incredible redundancy of indexing and operation here. This is a photographic record of a fingerprinting record. The photographic index and the physical indexing of Mrs. Parks's actual index finger is on display here. There's a redoubling and even a tripling of the effort to get Rosa Parks into the system, to register her reckless flesh, to use Nicole Fleetwood's powerfully apt term describing Black women's visual reception within white supremacist misogynist culture, as officially illicit. What do we see when we look where the index is pointing us? What do we see of Black life? Black life looks like a Black woman artist putting pen to paper, recruiting her artistic and physical labor to produce large-scale portraits of African-American women whose own labors for freedom were regarded as illicit and rendered as mugshots. It looks like Black women organizing a boycott, relying upon their own relationships and committing to the worthwhile expenditure of their physical labor in the pursuit of anti-racist justice. It looks like Black women today putting foot to pavement and organizing against voter suppression and disenfranchisement, and for the mattering of Black life in general. I was overjoyed in the process of researching for this presentation to see where the Black index pointed me. I discovered this poster by the African-American woman typographer Gail Anderson, quoting the African-American woman activist Marian Wright Edelman. It is an image I feel I was led to, even though I could not always see who or what was pointing the way. Anderson deploys the Manicule in this poster. Here, oversized and stylized, but retaining the hash lines that signal a woodcut, though they are almost certainly not the imprint of woodcuts, but pop art interpretations. The images of Manicule are identical, except that one is reversed to give the impression of a right hand and a left hand gesturing in opposite vertical directions. The quotation from Edelman is laid out in two parts, creating both vertical and horizontal balance, and aligning with a temporal logic of past and future. The first, longer sentence declaring the irretrievable passage of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi from our present is formatted in a regular but overall slightly smaller type than the second part of the quotation. The three sentences on the right that call us in the here and now to create a just future. Deliberately or unconsciously, Edelman's statement maps a trajectory of justice work that includes a history of male leaders, but has opened into a present in which a we that includes at the very least one woman, the speaker herself, Marian Wright Edelman, is an agent of change. This Manicule points to a past justice project that, as scholar Erica Edwards notes in her book Charisma, has fixated upon the figure of the charismatic male leader. But the other Manicule points in the opposite direction, towards a future comprised of a we that is inclusive of a you, and that is first spoken and then printed by Black women. So, where are we going and where have we been? Hopefully, in what I have offered to you today, you have the sense that wherever we are headed, Black women will be there, as they have always been, shaping the terms of Blackness and its visual representations. I want to conclude my remarks then by offering as well an encouragement to visit and revisit the philosophy and study of visual representation known as semiotics, and put that in service to a Black feminist project. As is clear from our familiarity with the term the index, as well as the typographical term the stereotype, we are already speaking and thinking in terms of visual culture and semiotics in much of our thinking about race, gender, and justice. So in closing, I want to recommend that we do go deeply into this field as a form and practice of Black liberation studies. To quote Marian Wright Edelman, "We are it. It is up to us. It is up to you." Thank you.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was delightful. And I just, want to keep thinking about all of the places that you pointed us in your own work as a way to think about this project. So first, I want to thank you for just really focusing on the concept of the show and the language. I think it's such a good place to start, and especially because you're our first speaker, you're helping to frame the whole discourse and conversation around the show. So to think about indexicality for me, it's also about classification and this desire to revolt against or push back against the classification of what Black is in some easy way in which we are indexed and easily found. And the artwork then, as you did so lovely in such a lovely way with the great Lava Thomas's artwork, like that
Phenomenal.
Very delicate and I would say very loving description of what's happening in that work, and the focus on hands. It makes me think about scholar Jackie Francis. She also writes about hands in Bearden's work, and I think both of you are turning us as viewers back to the Black body as a source of labor and information, as light, which I think is really important. So I wanted to I have a question as I'm gonna pick some questions from Q&A also. I was so
Sure.
surprised and loved that slide of the drawings of hands.
Oh,
For,
the 1901, the typographical,
well,
the Manicule.
before that, with the cat urinating on the
Yes.
manuscript.
Yeah, I think that may have been what where I started to become, I think it's where I learned the term manicule, because it also, you know, has that really amusing relationship to this revered print object, right? This is appearing in, at this point, before Western movable type, a hand lettered manuscript that just gets, you know, peed on by cats. And then there's another layer of, you know, the book is meant to last. It's meant to endure. It's an art object, right? This is the significance. The paper is hard to come by, right? This is a very precious object, and it's been, you know, presumably desecrated by a cat that doesn't appreciate the very human gesture of writing. And then, in order to kind of provide a redress to that organic insult, that monk writes in a curse to the cat, but also, you know, points out the areas of desecration, because they're not going to be there to point it out, right? So it's stand-in for their own body and what they want you to see, and pointing out marginalia, and the ways in which we continue with this, and that it really straddles, as Marianne Doan brings out, in terms of the index in general. But I feel like this figure of the manicule is really is further frustrates those boundaries and those classifications that we get, and that are very useful, and from structural linguistics, and from Peirce, and also from Ferdinand de Saussure. But what I often see happening as part of Black life and as part of Black feminist thought is that those boundaries and categories very rarely fully explain us, even as these attempts to index us and classify us, you know, to put Rosa Parks, to put Alberta James into a catalog of illicit, unlawful Black women. There's so much more. We always are already exceeding gestures.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was thinking also, one of the tensions I think you brought out in your talk is that, you know, thinking about that early manuscript, that the manicule is being used to point out error. You know, that here's something where something, here's some place I want you to see where something went wrong. And in your discussion of the index and the manicule, you're talking about the excess, right? That specifically, right, that Black femme life always exceeds its photographic referent, right? I think I'm paraphrasing, I don't think that's exact, but it was like, yes, you know, that was such a moment of validation, and in the criminal justice system, showing the hand pointing, showing the fingerprint, right? That these are people who have broken the law, who are acting out and outside of our system, right? And you're saying, where does that hand point us? It points us to Black women's labor. It points us to mass action. It points us to ultimately cultural change. And you know, and you were talking also about Black liberation. So I just wanted to re-articulate how I thought super that was.
Thank you. It was a lot to bring together, but as you're bringing out, the labor part is really crucial, and it's not. I think that there's, you know, as you say, pointing out the error. what I also love in your framing of the show, it's not about abandoning an inauthentic or inaccurate or kind of negative
No.
representation. It's about thinking about the elsewhere, right? The beyond the frame, the supplement, right? Or and also what's being concealed or what's hidden or what's under erasure.
Yeah. I'm going to get to some of these questions that we have.
Yeah.
So Jennifer Brody says, thank you so much for your brilliant talk. I loved your reading of the Manicule and of Miss Thomas's powerful work. Can you say more about where or how you figure the artist's hand here in this project?
Yeah. Yeah. That is, I'm so inspired by this, invitation, Bridget, that I'm excited to kind of keep going with this. But to respond to Dr. Brody, Brody's question and observation, and I'm thinking back to Nikki Green's commentary as well, in relation to that piece on Ramar Bearden, that what gets pointed back to is labor, is care, right? And something I think that what Doan is trying to point out, the overdetermination of the photographic index, is that we lose sight of other prior and also enduring forms of indexicality, that most often it's not just a click. While it is interesting to think about, the shutter click being the only moment of a digital manipulation when we're talking about photographic imagery, but we're still producing art and visual objects in a variety of ways, whether it's typesetting or whether it's drawing or whether it's walking and taking the bus, right? Or signing or registering someone to vote. There's a lot of labor. There's a lot of labor involved, and I think the index is a way to, as you said, to get us to return to the body, to think about the bodies and the work involved in producing representation.
And I wonder if part of Brody's question might have been also about art making, the artist's hand, and and Lava Thomas, of course, can speak about her own practice, but just as for us as viewers, I think because her work is so exquisite and meticulous, just if you had any thoughts as a viewer, not as the artist, but what you think about that, that effort and that project, the artist's hand in making these images.
There's an uncanniness to the the realism of it. But the realism, you can tell that it's a consequence of an extraordinary, it's almost an excruciating amount of time to imagine, the kind of constantly looking, making the mark, looking back and making the mark, because I see she's attempting to be quite faithful to that original mugshot image with some important, variations. But there's yeah, for me, it seems like an act of redress, of restoring handicraft in a certain sense. So kind of confronting the abusiveness of the instantaneous, cursory, and very specific genre of the mugshot photo, right? It's not just a photographic practice itself or photographic technology, but specifically of the mugshot, and that genre in which produces images of Black women.
Yeah, thank you so much. So a couple of other comments, questions. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that you think it's important for scholars in visual studies to think with and through semiotics. What theorists and authors do you consider to be important entryways into thinking Black visual studies along semiotics?
Well, I think your work,
Oh, thank
Dr. Bridget Cook. I think I mentioned Nikki Green's essay. She's a associate professor now at Wellesley in art history. I mean, this actually, I would say that even beyond just semiotics, I would say art history, and where there's an extraordinary number of Black women who are working in art history. Cheryl Finley, yourself, Lee Rayford writes about photography and the civil rights era. My mind is just blanking, but I think that there's a way in which semiotics, I didn't mention Nicole Fleetwood. I would also very importantly put her work in there. And then I would say myself too, because I think that we're all trying to think through some of what we inherited through our own training in terms of the hold that linguistics and kind of these structuralist kind of ways of understanding visual culture. And even also a figure like Stuart Hall, who I think people are returning to him, and I hope they're increasingly returning to his work and paying attention to the ways in which Stuart Hall as a cultural theorist, a Black cultural theorist, coming out of the Black Afro-Caribbean experience, is really taking visual culture, on all visual culture, really, really seriously, and thinking about it as coextensive with how we live, and so is able to bring in and make connections with like W.J.T. Mitchell. Certainly, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis at Harvard is doing incredible work in thinking through even how to, as Stephen Best puts it, how to think like a work of art. So those are a few folks.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Ella Turin, who's a grad student at UCI. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Baker.
She was also my colleague at Occidental.
Oh, of course.
She's an amazing person.
This is great. Yes,
Hi, Ella.
And she helped to write the extended artist bios for the catalog for the show. So she's definitely an interlocutor. So she says, I love the idea of the work providing redress. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about the relationship between this redress and the work Black artists do to center Blackness, Black life, and Black humanity.
I think in a certain way, that's a lot of what a lot of Black artists are doing. And I think that, I think there's a very useful way of thinking about that, particularly in the African-American context, and thinking about that, the African-American art history, and the particularly high stakes battle of Black representation, both visual representation, but also civic representation. The stakes are really high when we're talking about Black representation. And I'll speak mostly to the African-American tradition because I just know that one better, but as I know from also Tina Kampf's work, one can track this in Germany and on the African continent, that there's one way of understanding the work of Black artists is is in the context of an anti-Black campaign. And one of the terrains of that global campaign to justify exploitation and domination was the visual field. So Black artists, I would say, don't necessarily need to be trying to produce an image of Blackness that is directly performing some kind of redress for a specific icon or a specific stereotype. But I think that's the very impulse to identify Black people as worthy of a dignified representation is already situated in a circumstance of redress because of the great intensity of anti-Blackness that we know, that we've seen that for centuries. Yeah, for centuries.
So it's even that.
So I would just add to say that I think that Black artists are some of our our greatest keepers and the greatest folks who care for Black life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. And right, just the act of deciding you're going to be an artist, that you are going to make work, is part of the act of redress, right? That is part of the rebelliousness or the insistence on Black life, right? Yeah. We have a comment here, I think, from Catherine Benjamin, who's faculty in film and media studies at UCI. Thank you for a very provocative talk. What immediately came to mind when I viewed the drawings is that, yes, there is a delinking of the institutional, quote, index from the Black feminine figure, which is where we look for presence. So we begin to interrogate, and again in quotes, how am I supposed to look at this image, right? Rather than being guided by the institutional frame, we follow the figures outside of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking that, yeah, the following my suggestion is kind of inspired by Saidiya Hartman as well. I mean, and she spends so much time in Wayward Lives looking at photographs and thinking about the interior possibilities, interior lives of the Black women who were photographed, but whose commentary has not been registered in the archives. To think about, well, what is going on beyond the frame? What happens after the image has been taken? And also in terms of the institutional frame that Dr. Benjamin is mentioning, whether it's the institutional frame of criminality, of the mugshot, or of the archive, which grants access to only certain subjects, or the institutional space of the gallery, right? That there are constantly ways of, we're constantly negotiating multiple frames, and I think that's something that we can actually see in some of those images and those figurative representations of that Thomas reproduces, in particular, of the women of the Montgomery bus boycott. Because in some ways her gesture is taking them out of the space of the conditions of the mugshot to invoke the question of what other purpose might this image be and this likeness be put. And I appreciate that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for accepting the challenge of taking on, the question of the Black Index, and the argument that I think, well, that I am making through the show. And yeah, I appreciate your insight and I hope, as you mentioned, if this is exciting, that you really continue on. I mean, we'd love to see more of what you're thinking about with Black indexicality and some of the tensions and illuminations, I suppose.
Oh, and now that the show is open, I can't wait to visit it. And thank you for curating it. Also, your labor being imperative in this work.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. Yes, you know, with COVID, I have to make an appointment to see the show, and so I'm excited to be able to do that. Oh, and we have one question that just came in. So, hello, Dr. Baker. Thank you very much for your talk and great discussion. I wonder if the notion and motion of the index, pointing the finger at the other, gives authority to the viewer, or it brings the authority back to the creator of the index. Keeping in mind that there are three fingers pointing. Yes, this is right, what you always hear people say. When you point at someone, you have three fingers pointing back at you, right? So keeping in mind that there are three fingers pointing towards the opposite direction, another major discussion.
I mean, I think that there's something really powerful to that truism, I'll call it. I found that I couldn't even escape from that. And I think that there's rather than thinking about, I think that we're burdened by a certain version of indexicality that makes claims to certainty, but there is an encouraging aspect of indexicality in the ways in which it returns us to embodiment. It's not just pointing, it's a hand. It's a decision to mark something out. There's a labor, there's a choice, and there's a body, there are bodies. And to not just look at where we're going, but also where we have been and who has been pointing us there. That would be my broader kind of more philosophical way of adapting or translating what I'm kind of trying to argue, that we already kind of intuit and know about how indexing and indexicality work. That we're on the right track. We just need to kind of return to thinking about how we know what we know. So in terms of authority, I think that, yeah, that it's part of a thinking through and a process. And so it was joyful to kind of repeat and retrace some of Lava Thomas's steps. And to retrace and to kind of embody and to feel in my body what it would be like, not just to be a sitter, to be one of the women, Alberta James or Rosa Parks, thinking about their posture, which I can see, but also thinking about Lava Thomas's patience and care in rendering those women.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, well, I think we're going to bring this to a close. I know you've been talking for a while, so I just want to thank you, Courtney, again for your generosity of time and thought in opening up the conversation about the exhibition. And I will also just remind people to look at the exhibition website, theblackindex.art. We will have a program tomorrow that starts at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, co-hosted by the Getty. And we will have the opportunity to hear Lava Thomas talk about her work. This particular series with Lee Rayford, the brilliant scholar who you mentioned, who teaches at Berkeley. And then another artist in the show, Whitfield Lovell, is going to be in conversation with LaRon Brooks, who's a curator of modern and contemporary collections at the Getty. So another event to look forward to. Thank you very much, everyone who's here, and again to Courtney Baker. And hopefully you'll be able to see the show. And it's also touring. So if you don't get a chance now because of COVID, you should be able to get a chance later. Okay, thank you everyone, and take care, stay safe. Practice your self-care skills in these early days of January 2021. Bye.
Thank you.